What do you see when you look at Pac-Man? Apart from somewhat resembling a partially eaten pizza, something his original designer was inspired by, what thoughts does his glorious yellow hide inspire? Well, he seems a relatable humanoid entity, a familiar but nebulous representation of us in digital form. It's strange how iconic he is given how ambiguous he seems. Is he even a he? We only knew this for sure when Miss Pac-Man came out. In any case, what attributes would you ascribe him? Well, he's clearly a voracious capitalist consumer whose giant gaping maw is an emblem of our insatiable desire to consume. Or maybe he is a narcoleptic pill popper who has a substance addiction, and who occasionally turns on the phantasmal ghost that set out to capture him. The point I'm trying to make here is that the rules and systems that govern abstract shapes generate their own meaning, and we can't help but see these zany shapes with this narrative screen. This is the language of video games, and who better to illustrate this point than our favorite jaundiced muncher, a video game icon if there ever was one. An icon is a species of sign, something that is meant to stand in for something else. Charles Sanders Peirce argued that these come in three flavors: a symbol, an icon, and an index. A symbol is a sign that stands in for something else without resembling it in any way. So the letters C, A, and T next to each other somehow come to stand for all those things that star in those YouTube videos we watch unendingly. An index is a sign that points to something else, whether in space or in time. A map is a good example of this, showing where things lie in relation to one another. An icon is something that resembles the thing it is meant to represent in some sense, like how your desktop trash can icon looks like an actual rubbish bin.
There's obviously overlap here, as a map points to things, but also vaguely resembles the geography it is trying to depict. I suppose you get the point though.
So what does this philosophical pontification say about our yellow friend? He is a symbol, as he is an arbitrary stand-in for our avatar in the game, but he is also an icon, resembling a mouth, a pizza, a drug addict, or whatever else. But once he starts moving and munching on hapless dots, he is the embodiment of consumption. Games teach us the species of sign changes with movement and interaction. They can't just be interpreted as static objects. The maze he is going through looks like a map, so it could be pointing to something, but there is no such maze in reality. But wait, it existed in the minds of its developers, and it had a purpose behind it. So the maze is an index for the people who constructed it for the purposes of our entertainment. The ghosts that chase Mario are interesting, as they have eyes, making them higher fidelity icons than Pac-Man, but they are also indexical, as the eyes point to where they are moving to next. They are premeditating where they are going, all the better for us, I suppose. The dots on the screen don't seem to have any iconic significance, until that is you add Pac-Man, where they can be read iconically as pills, or symbolically as consumer goods. Sometimes fruit pops up, and this gives a higher boost to Pac-Man's score. So is this now a parable about the benefits of consuming healthy vegetation? I've probably intrigued some of you and pissed many more of you off, but this kind of symbolic reading is essential both for us as a species as well as our understanding of games. Terence Deacon calls us the symbolic species, and he argues that our ability to understand objects as standing in for other objects without bearing a resemblance to them is what makes us intelligent. It gives us language, religion, myth, tradition, and yes, games. Games are symbolically enclosed worlds with their own internal language that are fundamentally beholden only to their internal logic, but occasionally, we can't help but read stories into these abstractions because, as Pac-Man shows us in more ways than one, icons are inevitable. Let's jump down this rabbit hole further. The lives at the bottom of the screen are an icon of an icon, our initial Pac-Man, and are indices of the lives he has, as well as being symbolic. The score is an index of your performance, and is symbolic of certain arbitrary numerical quantities. In games, the whole concept of a heads-up display and interface is just a series of icon symbols and indices used in different order to highlight your current state, your objective, and the state of the world itself. They convey information without having to outline things in elaborate detail, simplifying the interpretive process. Objects in the world are also symbolic. How do we as game players know that health packs mean ability to restore HP? They symbolize some kind of healing procedure, although this is never shown in most games. A waypoint on a map is an arbitrary dot, but it symbolizes what your singular goal ought to be whilst in the bounds of the game. A controller is just a symbolic device that corresponds with certain actions in another symbolic world. In Street Fighter, a quarter circle input and punch gives you a Hadouken, a fireball that is meant to be symbolic, or is it iconic, of the character's inner manifestation of chi. It is also indexical of a certain pattern of strategy that your opponent might use as information to gauge their next move. See, moves, countermoves, strategies, and interactions are all symbolic in video games. They don't just represent what, but also when and how. Like, when should I deploy my move in response, and how should I go about trying to surround the enemy fortress? We use symbolic cues to coordinate our actions, plans, and strategies, and so good games make sure to have as much intuitively visible information so players know how to play. In our world, yellow is symbolic of many things: light, glow, radiance, and royalty. But in Uncharted's world, it represents something you can actually climb. Here's a paradox. As games become more graphically capable, they become more and more iconic, resembling the things they are trying to represent. But because of this, the oddities become more salient. The symbolic language of Pac-Man's universe was more pure, whereas the one in Uncharted's creates some dissonance. Isn't it ironic then that Pac-Man is still more iconic than Nathan Drake, as he is still known by more people? Now the word iconic itself is symbolic of many meanings, but that would be pushing it too far. The thing about realistic design is that it draws more things in for us, but it doesn't allow us to read games in their purely symbolic language. The more iconic, the less ambiguous. Unless, of course, you're Pac-Man. Pac-Man was one of the first video games to resonate with women, and it's curious to ponder why. Maybe it was its ambiguity so they could relate for once, or maybe the theme of eating is loved by all. Maybe it suggests how capitalism has even managed to pervade women's minds in a traditionally male-dominated industry. Maybe Pac-Man just doesn't seem palpably violent, and so women don't mind it. When Pac-Man inevitably dies, which he will unless you quit, he folds in on himself, suggesting he is consumed by his own appetite. Is this now a critique of capitalism? If the iconography was more explicit, the meaning would be more salient, but the ambiguity allows broader interpretation. Take this video created by the researchers Hyder and Simo, which is just a bunch of shapes, but many interpret it as a meaningful story, or in my favorite comment on the subject, still a better love story than Twilight. My point is that we kind of have lost the beauty of the symbolic language inherent in video games, as they become more and more like reality. Actually, scratch that. We have lost our ability to interpret things symbolically because of how iconically realistic everything is. Trying to marry gameplay and narrative in games is one of the biggest problems in our medium, and unless we go back to rediscover this lost art, we may still be having issues. When Popeye eats spinach, he suddenly becomes an incomparably strong squint. Just like when Pac-Man eats these blobs, he becomes capable of attacking his pursuants. So what are these blobs symbolic of? They symbolize the ability to fundamentally reorganize the moral, psychological, and institutional landscape of Pac-Man's world. They are momentary transformations of the existing order. It's like when Zelda gets his horse, or the journey person, itself deeply iconic, gets a scarf. It's an essential step on the hero's journey, being symbolic of an ability to confront the chaos that faces you. So maybe there's more to Pac-Man than we thought. Like when King Arthur extracts the sword from the stone, it doesn't just mean he did it. It signifies a recognition of lost lineage in a kingdom mired in depravity. These are sometimes referred to as floating signifiers, in that they change the prevailing order of signs. So now, Pac-Man is an industrious, adventurous protagonist who is pushing back against the encroachment of tyrannical ghost-like entities by arming himself with a weapon that signifies him as the chosen one who is to inherit the lost kingdom of partially eaten pizzas. What happens if this power is telegraphed by something else? That then becomes an index of a sign that revolutionizes the relationship between signs. Zeus's father Kronos received a prophecy that he would be killed by his offspring, so he consumed them. A contemporary of Pac-Man, surely. This was an index of a future event that serves as a floating signifier of a changing order. The irony, of course, is this very act of trying to avoid his fate sets Zeus on a revenge spree, which leads to Kronos' perpetual damnation. The idea is that knowledge of the future changes our actions in the present, which leads to the fulfillment of that future you were trying to avoid. Games are full of these things. In an intense session of Dark Souls, we know there may be a bonfire around the next corner, so that index of a future sign that promises to change the prevailing order makes us try harder right now. If we see the health of a boss failing, that knowledge of a potential victorious future may force us to act more aggressively, leading to our untimely death. In philosophy, the idea that the future can affect the present is sometimes called downward causation, where symbolic emergence can somehow exercise causal powers. Most philosophers hate this idea, because it suggests emergent systems that are produced by rules can actually cause things to change at lower levels. This gives room for things like consciousness and free will to have causal power, as although the brain is made of atoms, the emergent mind can affect the being in such a way that can reconfigure the elements at a lower level. Ridiculous perhaps, but commonplace in the games we play. Whenever Pac-Man reaches 10,000 points, he gets an additional life, changing the landscape of risk and reward. A small fruit icon pops up as a prophecy at the bottom of the screen, indicating it is coming soon to provide an abundance of points. This is now a sign of another sign that changes the configuration among signs. It is the warning Oedipus got about killing his father and marrying his mother that led him to accidentally kill his father and marry his mother. Except in Pac-Man's in our case, it allows for us to plan for the future by using symbolic markers of a non-existent hypothetical. We can escape the trap of fate in games, perhaps in violation of the laws of our actual universe. Maybe not, but it helps sell video games as an interesting medium. What if the narrative embedded in the game isn't Pac-Man's but ours? In his GDC talk Storytelling Tools for Designers, Haggis argues that even abstract games like Tetris have an intrinsic plot. We as the player have a motivation to succeed, and we persevere in the face of ever-increasing obstacles for the purposes of some arbitrary score. And then, well, we die. This is sounding more and more like a tragedy. Analyzing the meaning of a game from within the player's mind elicits a different view on the story, and for the most part, the game plays like a digital form of tag and maze runner as we flee helplessly from our ghostly antagonists until of course we turn the tables. The AI of the 4 ghosts are quite fascinating. Blinky, the red one, chases you by viewing your current position. Pinky aims at 2 tiles ahead of Pac-Man, so she seems to be lying in ambush anticipating your moves. The blue fellow, Inky, has rather peculiar behavior, determined by a system that uses a mix of Inky's and Blinky's movements and positions to triangulate your location. Apparently this maths leads him to erratic movements, but we can't hold it against him for trying. Finally, Clyde is a moron. He chases you if he's 8 tiles away from you, but if he's in close, he flees to the corner of the screen. He's kind of like a troubadour, who longs for the love of a particular woman, but is paralyzed by the fear of intimacy and ruining his idealized affection when he gets too close, so he curls up in a corner and wallows. This AI system is called a finite state machine, which runs some predetermined scripts for AI, the ones I just mentioned, until a state change happens. In a game like Metal Gear Solid 3, that happens when you are spotted, but in Pac-Man, these AI systems actually increase in speed over time, creating a sense of dramatic tension as the game progresses, and the different enemies allow for emergent novelty to keep players constantly on their toes. Every game plays a little differently, giving the game long-term strategic depth. Another thing that does this is the ability to go through one side of the screen and come out the other, giving the play space a completely new dynamic. Do you know what shape a flat rectangle with opposite sides attaching actually is? You have to roll the edges around to connect it, and doing so with 2 edges creates a cylinder. If you fold the other side and curve it underneath and, well, explaining this is impossible, it actually turns into a torus, otherwise known as a donut. So Pac-Man is actually a pizza trapped on a cosmic donut, finally explaining why he is perpetually hungry and turning those little dots into cosmic sugar pellets. He is in fact living in a bounded but infinite universe, and any direction he looks in actually reveals the very space he inhabits. Looking out one side of the screen will reveal the back of his own head, but looking past this creates an infinite array of Pac-Mans in an infinite set of rooms. If we conceptualize this in 3 dimensions, this might be the kind of universe we ourselves inhabit, but we have the good fortune of being trapped by our own cosmic bubble, constrained by the speed of light. To infinity and beyond actually means coming back to where you started, assuming you are living in this kind of Pac-Man universe. I've probably lost most of you at this point, but for those of you still here, think about all the symbolic language used in games and what it says about us. We are a symbol-manipulating species, engrossed by a symbol-manipulating medium, so perhaps we should return to thinking symbolically. If we strip away all the baggage from Pac-Man's multitudinous interpretations, what is the symbolic core left to us? Pac-Man was something of a revolution. Not only was he one of the first mascots, he established the maze chase genre, influenced the origin of the stealth genre, and even inspired the level structure of first-person shooters like Wolfenstein. He popularized the power-up, an integral part of games' pacing going forward, introduced the cutscene, birthing narrative-driven games, and showed the potential of using deterministic AI systems to craft emergent gameplay. Pac-Man shows his hand in everything from the level design of Doom, to the powered-up boost systems of SSX, to the cinematic interludes of Metal Gear Solid, a true gaming progenitor. The game design system of interweaving short-term guides in the form of pellets with a long-term objective, along with a scoring system and dynamic power-ups, is infused in so much of modern game design, it will be impossible to list all those who have been influenced by it. And of course, genre-wise, the game can be seen as a collectathon too, a trait that would be pervasive in all the mascot-based games that came a little later. However, I still stress the importance of Pac-Man's clear symbolic language as important for us today. In the original Super Mario Bros., the fact that you started on the left of the screen indicated that you needed to go right, the angry eyes of the Goomba signified him as an adversary, and the 2-path structure, coins and mushrooms, show a direct isomorphism with Pac-Man, teaching players what to do and how to do it without explicit instructions. In the original Zelda, there are 4 directions to go in, but the cave where the sword is stands out, signifying it as the way to go. Doom leveraged a game design term called orthogonal unit differentiation, which suggests creating depth comes from having distinct enemies along an axis of hit scan and projectile, or ranged and melee, and only clear symbolic cues for which enemy is which unleashes this strategic dynamic. Even more neglected in games is how symbolic reading is essential to reveal the unique artistry of meaningful mechanics. In Eco, the fact that you are forced to hold down a button to guide Yorda and that your health is tied to hers symbolizes unity, intimacy, and selflessness. In Brothers, the fact that you have to use 2 analog sticks to control 2 brothers symbolizes conflict and dependency. In Res, the synesthesia of the soundscape symbolizes being in the womb before our birth, where our perceptions were undifferentiated. And the escalating music symbolizes evolving towards our higher selves to approach Eden, a symbol for rebirth. In the most explicitly symbolic game Thomas Was Alone, the different relative sizes and abilities of each shape was drawn to signify the different personalities of each character. But the union between these archetypes, using the interdependencies of the mechanics, tells a Jungian story of integrating different aspects of our psyche. Thinking to the future, the importance of understanding the symbolism of movement, body language, and AI personalities will be ever increasingly important as we devise virtual worlds with more dense narrative possibilities. There is a reason I've decided to take you on this admittedly absurd journey. Scott McCloud in his book Understanding Comics claimed that deeply abstract iconic imagery is more powerful because it can convey universal themes as opposed to the specificities of a particular event. This means the built-in language of games has the potential to convey more universal themes just through its mechanics. This is echoed by the ideas of Ian Bogost, who talks about his idea of procedural rhetoric in his book Persuasive Games, which is the ability to use mechanics to teach people about ideas. An example of this is Missile Command, which lets the anxiety inherent in trying to save multiple cities from annihilation tell an anti-nuclear parable. Another reason for emphasizing the absurd causal loops in Pac-Man is because it seems likely that a general theory for games will have to incorporate something like this. In his book The Aesthetic of Play, Brian Upton talks about the possibility or phase space of a game and how current available actions called the horizon of action will combine with possible future states and past options to create a model for how we actually interact with games. For example, in the Tetris effect, on the right of the screen you see 4 pieces ahead, allowing you to plan a horizon of intention, but on the left, you have a stored piece, which is a measure of the past, and these interact with the present play space to create a kind of temporally distributed play. I'll be delving into these ideas more in the future, but ultimately, this is all mediated by symbolically encoded language. To leave on a somewhat violent note for a rather peaceable icon, one of the developers at Rockstar stated how they came up with the idea for a digital fantasy in the form of a driving game that allows players to do what they want, including running down civilians. They just didn't know how to conceptualize it. They took one good look at Pac-Man's level structure and saw the grid-like intricacies of a city, and the dots looked vaguely reminiscent of innocent bystanders. Could it be that our yellow-bellied progenitor was the first case of vehicular homicide against innocent bystanders, and the ghosts were trying to capture and subdue this reckless miscreant before he brought about harm to himself and the world around him? However, since Pac-Man inevitably dies, does this then become a devastating critique of the language of violence inherent in games, or a sadistic power fantasy par excellence? Fortunately, the purely symbolic makeup of the game allows us to read whatever we want into it, and so I prefer a heroic narrative about refuting fate. Then again, maybe I was bound to interpret it that way. Thank you for watching, guys. If you can come up with any more self-consistent, wacky theories about the hidden meaning of Pac-Man, I'd love to hear them. If you want more content like this, please be sure to subscribe. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.